Good morning, afternoon, everyone. Bob Pressey needs no introduction, but I've been asked to give him one anyway. Bob came to JCU in 2007. Shortly thereafter, he became a distinguished professor, one of the three inaugural ones. There are now, I think, 6 distinguished professors. I'm a distinguished professor too, but I don't use the title because it makes me sound too old. Bob has also recently been elected a Fellow of the Australian Academy of Science for his internationally recognised contribution to conservation biology. Most of you will know that Bob has had an unconventional career for an academic, that is, in that he didn't do the senior lecturer as professor track. He worked for most of the middle of his career in New South Wales government for the National Parks and Wildlife Service. Is that what it's called? Where he played a huge role in developing the terrestrial park system of New South Wales. So we're very lucky to have him here now as program leader of Program 6 in the ARC Centre of Excellence, which focuses on conservation planning. Since he's come here, Bob has gathered around him a significant group of people, which I think now is on the order of 6 postdocs, a couple of technicians, and about 8 PhD students. Starting from scratch 5 years ago, that's pretty impressive. And in the last year, he's had his first cohort of about half a dozen PhD students complete their degree. So Bob's a really good example of JCU making a strategic investment in bringing somebody really smart and a workaholic to boot to JCU. So it's a great pleasure to introduce Bob.
Okay, thanks, Terry. Hopefully you've had a look at the abstract I sent around, because it gives you the idea. It was meant to give you the idea that the title is what it says, that I'm exploring some ideas here. I don't know about putting an engagement strategy together. I just know it's important, and sure, I've thought about it over the years, but I haven't really got one together, and that's where I'd like to go now, and I want to use this seminar as a way of getting there. I said in the abstract that there would be a preamble to that to set the scene, and I decided in putting this talk together that I'd have a preamble to the preamble. And just to give you a bit of background, to elaborate slightly on what Terry just said. So the preamble to the preamble is got this diagram in it, and it's a diagram that I downloaded. It's a landscape. If you've done optimization, you'll know about local optima, global optima. Sometimes to get from a local optima, you have to go through some suboptimal country to find the highest point of the landscape. And in case you're thinking that I'm going to start talking about optimization algorithms and conservation planning, I'm not. I'm about over-optimization, really. I want to use this to make a point about my career move to JCU. Some years ago, as Terry said, for about 19 years I was in national parks as a research scientist. For most of that time it was a great place to work, and we had space to do science. We were challenged constantly to be relevant to management policy, and we got better at doing that. We made some conservation gains, and it was a great place to be. Then we were restructured, combined, cut a long story short, combined with some other agencies. New management style. Don't worry about outcomes, think about process. It's all about process. And this had been coming for a while, this sort of trend in state government in general, not just in national parks, to the point where at one stage, before we were restructured, we had a Director General who took himself fairly seriously, wanted to meet all the science staff. We sat around a big table, and the scientists in national parks were not backward in expressing their views. And they expressed their views about this guy and what he was doing, and he was quite upset. Well, he was furious, really. left the meeting in a temper. A few minutes later, one of my colleagues was in a lift. This guy walked into the lift, the doors closed, two of them there together, and he said to my colleague, do you know what your problem is? You're concerned about outcomes, not process. And then stormed out of the lift, and my colleague was left thinking, I guess that's true. And that really sort of sums up the way the whole sort of mentality of the organisation was going. It got to the point, and again, to cut a long story short, where they were happy for me to do science pretty well as long as I lived, as long as I didn't do any conservation planning in New South Wales, the new management style, which I found obnoxious and offensive. And I would come home in the evening and drink too much G&T and whinge to my wife about it. And one night she said, why don't you just resign? And even if you haven't been in that position, you can imagine how liberating it is for your spouse to say, I know we've got kids, I know we've got a mortgage, just resign and we'll take a chance. And at that point, I started a journey away from a local optimum through some fairly uncertain times. And although I didn't regret resigning, I must say, but times were uncertain, and ended up in a much better place, which is here. And now I've got more capacity for research than I've ever had. I've got more capacity to engage than I've ever had, and more ways to engage than I've ever had. And I'm in a really good place. I think I'm in a global optimum, which is why I've got that diagram there. And there's a lot of people to thank for that. A lot of people have helped me along the way. A lot of people have really supported me since I arrived here. The two that come most readily to mind are my wife Libby and Terry Hughes, who offered me a job here, and I'm really pleased that I took it. So the moral of that story is that's another way of talking about going from a local to a global optimum. You can wash up in a good place. Wasn't guaranteed, but it happened. So hopefully that gives you the idea that I'm fairly serious about engagement. You could be asking, why have I waited 5 years to give this seminar? I've been busy, that's the main answer. And there's been a lot to do, a lot to line up, and it's lined up, and I've now got a bit of space to say, with all the time that I have ahead, and there's a lot, I hope, of doing conservation planning at JCU, how can I make best use of my time and the time of my PhDs and postdocs? How do we set out a strategy for doing all that? So that was the preamble. Before the preamble, so the preamble now is some statements that I'm going to make that I think are true. I don't have a lot of data to back them up. So this gives you a better idea, hopefully, of the motivation for giving this seminar and in fact for me doing conservation planning. One is that real conservation is hard. Pretend conservation is easy, but real conservation is hard because it really is about someone giving something up. Saving things, saving biodiversity, let's focus on biodiversity, is about not doing something that would have destroyed it. And that usually means foregoing profit or convenience or something. And that's hard to do. In a liberal democracy, it's fairly hard. The other thing that I believe, one more thing I believe, is that good science is necessary but not sufficient. I'm excited all the time by good science, as you are. But in terms of making a difference out there, you need something else as well. You've got to add value to that good science, actively add value to that good science. And of course you have to have it. And it's got to be as exciting and robust as possible. But it's not enough in itself to make a difference. And the reason for that is that if we rely on diffusion, it's very slow and very patchy. And we really have to move to transfusion, and that doesn't mean holding managers down and sticking stuff in them that they don't want. But it means actively engaging with people and giving them the information that you think they need and having them tell you what information they think they need and engaging in an active way. That seems straightforward enough. But there are lots of ways of doing that. The other point that I'll make is that the intellectual, I don't want to get to the end of my career and look back and say, you know, those management agencies, if they had used my science, they would have made much better decisions and got much better outcomes. That's not all that satisfying. I want to make sure, as much as possible, that policymakers and managers are using the best possible science, whether it's mine or someone else's, so that decisions really are as good as they can be. And then there's questions. So given all that, how serious are conservation scientists about really making a difference? Some years ago, 2001, there was a paper that stirred a lot of conservation scientists up. It was an editorial of conservation biology, and that was the title. So clearly designed to be provocative. Is this just a displacement activity for academia? I think they had a point. I still think they've got a point. I thought they were being a bit harsh at the time. What they were saying was, you know what, we know Indonesia really well. 2 people from the World Bank. Sumatra and lowland forests just about gone. A lot of conservation science being done. How come? It's a pretty harsh way to put it. But I think in the years since then, I've asked myself questions like that. Because some of these things do seem so big that we can't possibly do anything about it. But I think we have to have a look at those and think about what we actually can do. Maybe we're selling ourselves short in terms of our potential influence. More generally, I think it's a good question to ask because some conservation scientists do engage in displacement activities. That's my observation. And that's a pity because they're not making their work as relevant as it could be. So here's a diagrammatic way of summing up the situation as I see it. We know that biodiversity is declining. There's pretty good evidence for that. And let's say we're here now. A default outcome is simply to stand back and let it happen, and then there'll be some stuff left. The things that survive in cities, the things that survive in country that we haven't been able to convert to something else, cockroaches in the kitchen, and a few other things. If we inject science into this mix, again, this is a data-free graph, this is my contention, we can slow that and we can get a better outcome. My argument here is that if we inject good science and active, clever engagement, we'll get a better outcome still, and that will be our contribution. That's how we'll be judged as conservation scientists in 100 years, 200 years, by what's left. And it's the difference between the default outcome and what's actually still there. Okay, so here's some reflection on almost 30 years of systematic conservation planning. And I date systematic conservation planning from 1983. Before that, in 1979, something really important happened in Tasmania, in Hobart, at a kitchen table. And this guy did it, Jamie Kirkpatrick. He came up with the first reserve selection algorithm that included the concept of complementarity. He just made it up. Interestingly, it turned up independently several times later, but he was the first. And he had 2 journal papers out in 1983. And that's why I date systematic conservation planning, the idea of clear objectives, complementary sets of areas to achieve those objectives, as dating from 1983. Here's a map that I put together in New South Wales when that was my patch. And the green areas are regions that we covered with our decision support system. C-Plan we developed in the 1990s for the Regional Forest Agreement process as an interactive participatory decision support tool so that people could sit around, move things about, try scenarios and see what happened to outcomes, both for the timber industry and for biodiversity. And we worked in the mid-90s in this part of coastal New South Wales. Later the regional forest agreement processes were extended, and then there was a bunch of other regional applications, some local government applications around here, and a few marine applications. Okay, here's a map of current projects in this part of the world, the yellow dots in Program 6, the program that I lead, and almost all of those yellow dots involve engagement with managers, NGOs, policymakers, sometimes governments. So we've done a lot, okay, over the years. What's wrong with these two pictures? There's something wrong with both those two pictures. And what's wrong is all the engagement you can see there mapped out has been entirely opportunistic, not strategic. And yet the very notion of systematic conservation planning is about the limitations of ad hoc decisions and the importance of strategy and being able to see the bigger picture and move towards it. And yet we don't have a systematic strategy for engaging with the people who need to use this information. And that is a problem. And that's where I'm going with this talk. Here's another way of stating the problem. This is a world-beating, without doubt, rezoning process for the GBR. 2004, it was enacted. It was a fantastic process. We can look back now and see how we can improve it. That's always the case, 8 years later. It was a fantastic process. It hasn't been done as well yet in Australia. There's been a lot of recent work in Australia that's come nowhere near being as good as this. Most of what's done elsewhere in the world is nowhere near as good as this. And we hold up the GBR rezoning and the regional forest agreement process as two shining examples of the application of systematic conservation planning in the real world. But there's a problem with that too, in that if you look at these in a global context, they're odd. These regions are odd. They're simple governance. The regional forest agreement processes were public land only, not private land. This is first world marine, simple governance. There's a whole lot of things you can do in those places that are much harder elsewhere. And so we should hold them up as good examples, but we need to put them in context that there's a lot of other places where planning is harder and the uptake is harder as well. So here's a few things that we've got together. Some progress since over the last 5 years of Program 6 engaging in coastal Queensland. We've got a few links with the Commonwealth Government, particularly the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority. Folks in Canberra, a little more difficult. State government, that's problematic now with the new state government, but that will work itself out. Natural resource management organisations, some of these have been fantastic collaborators. There's a map of NRM regions in Queensland, and I've been, since I knew I had this job more than 5 years ago, I've been approaching these people, firing off emails, phoning, visiting, and with mixed reactions, and that's okay. I'm used to that. So we've got good links now with wet tropics here, with Mackay Whitsundays, and now, thanks to Alan Dale, one of my collaborators from the Cairns Institute, an emerging collaboration in Cape York. Some perplexing results elsewhere. Burdekin and Dry Tropics, an office in town, no engagement. Maybe I haven't been asking the right questions or saying the same things, but I've been there a lot and nothing happens. That's part of engagement. It doesn't always work. Fitzroy, several approaches, and the responses have been basically, no, we're not interested. So that's okay too. There are other places to go. So we are engaged with NRMs, and they're good. Local government's hard, in my experience, and patchy, but the doors are slowly starting to creak open. NGOs, the big ones, of course, WWF-TNC, a lot of staff, a lot of expertise, a lot of political clout. But then there's places like the shops like North Queensland Conservation Council, run on a shoestring by some very committed, smart people, and they're good to engage with as well. And then other people, of course, are engaged as well. So there's a fair bit going on in terms of engagement in coastal Queensland. But again, not very satisfying from my point of view in terms of me being able to say, I've got an engagement strategy and I know within the limits of my resources, I'm as effectively engaged with management policies as I can be. So here are some challenges, and I won't dwell on these because the scale of the challenge, I picked big ones, because I don't think we should shy away from the big ones. This is hard, of course, coal mining. I'm just starting to get a feel for what might be possible here, but it is a juggernaut. And there's a whole bunch of things happening, as you know, in inland Queensland and along the coast that give us cause for concern, and we need to think about how we position ourselves as a university, as well as, in my case, a conservation planning group, to have some input into the way that plays out. Getting protected areas right. One of the things that I've been harping on for a long time is that here's some data from northeastern New South Wales. If we analyse reserves in most places in Australia, northeast New South Wales is an example, where climate doesn't limit agriculture, what you find is, this is, just trying to find the cursor, low fertility, high fertility, steep slope, low slope, percentage reserved of those 9 environments, and you can see we've done a really good job, this is mid-90s, of reserving the steep infertile bits, and a very poor job of reserving the flat fertile bits. This plays out all over the world. I've got a review now that I've got 150 references and counting. Wherever people have looked, they find this. It's not always fertility and slope, but you find protected areas in swampy areas, disease-ridden areas, ice-covered areas, very high areas, arid areas, remote areas. It's all the crap country that people thought was convenient at the time to put into protected areas. Why is that a problem? Because the action, the loss of biodiversity, is happening in very different places. In other words, we're minimising the extent to which we intervene in loss, and that's a problem. So what do we do about it? Let's have a look at the Queensland Reserve System, and I'm just going to run through some points in terms of the kinds of reasons why we need to engage. We need to stay engaged with state government, the new state government. The reserve system is big. I think it's about 8 million hectares. I'm looking at Vanessa. It's a lot of country. If you look at regional ecosystems, the representation is generally poor. The reserves tend to be in the wrong places. Vanessa Adams and I are doing some analyses now in terms of reserves in relation to suitability for grazing and agriculture. And I'm anticipating the results because we don't have the data, but I'd be surprised if they were not in the least suitable areas, or concentrated in the least suitable areas. And that's a problem for the reason I just explained. So we need to start moving into somehow spatial protection of the areas that really need protection. Politically, that's inconvenient, but in biodiversity terms, important. We know that management's underfunded. Ian Craigie has been looking at that as a postdoc project, and he'll be able to put some numbers on the extent of underfunding for the end of that project. Vanessa did some work as part of a PhD, and this is way back in the Bligh government, before, in fact, the last Bligh government got in. The Bligh government. There was a promise to extend the protected area system to 20 million hectares by 2020. That's got a nice ring to it, and it would cost $120 million. And Vanessa's estimates, because there's a lot of uncertainty and assumptions involved, is that it was more likely to be an order of magnitude more, and might be 20 times as much as that. And that's useful because it starts to tell us what the job's going to cost. Off-park protection is always the fallback, of course, and that's dubious at the moment. And we need a major new initiative. We need the sort of injection of enthusiasm that we saw 2 or 3 decades ago at the Australian level. That won't come real fast. We need to try and bring that about. Sustainability. I'm not going to go into this in any sort of depth, but I am going to ask some questions about it. Sustainability is one of those wonderful terms that could mean just about anything. And often usually what we do in terms of setting our objectives for conservation planning is to set a percentage, and there's lots of reasons why that's very powerful. Politically, scientifically, in terms of analytically, it's a really convenient thing to do. 30% of a vegetation type, let's say, that's common, that kind of percentage. What that means is we're saying if this is extent or abundance on the horizontal, and this is how much we've got in our protected area system, and this is some measure of benefit, then our benefit maxes out at 30%. And then after that, it doesn't matter. There's no more benefit of having 35 or 40 or whatever. Those thresholds are very powerful scientifically, scientifically in the sense of being able to apply scientific conservation planning principles, and they're really powerful politically. But they're limited in that there's no biology in that. So a more realistic depiction of a benefit function in relation to how much of a vegetation type you've got would be a species area curve. And what this is telling us is that you've got 30%, you've got quite a lot of benefit, but you don't have all of it, and there's a benefit, there's more benefit to be gained from going to 35 or 40. The other reason I think this is really useful, apart from the underlying biological reality, is that it's basically saying if you don't have everything unless you've got everything. Okay, if you lost, let's go back. If we're talking about this one, that implies that we can take 70% of a vegetation type or a marine habitat out of action by replacing it with something else, and we're okay. What this is saying is every time you lose something, you lose something. You lose something on the horizontal, you'll lose something on the vertical, and that's reality. And that questions, that challenges us to define sustainability. Where on that curve? Where do we draw the line and say that's the limit of sustainability? So the biological reality comes with that challenge, that we're then in a discussion about where we lie on a benefit function. And that's the reality. That is the sort of discussion we should be having. There are other benefit functions. So there are sigmoidal functions that often emerge when you start to say, we're going to relate, say, the effective area of habitat on the horizontal to the probability of a species persisting over 500 years or 100 years. And a sigmoidal function will often emerge. And that's even scarier because you've got this sudden drop. So you can push it and push it and push it, and nothing much will happen. And then you are seriously at risk because of that big drop in the middle. And the steepness, of course, will vary from species to species. A scientist now retired once referred to the inflection point on one of these as aphoots, which means arse falls out of the system. So that's why we have to be careful with sigmoidal curves. And in terms of thinking about cumulative impacts in coastal Queensland, for dolphins, other megafauna, with port developments pushing ahead, we're not too clear where we are on that curve. We could be up the top, which would be comfortable. We could be in the process of the arse falling out of a species persistence, or we could already be in the dangerous territory on the left-hand side where it's really hard to get back up. And it's actually surprising how much we don't know. But that too is the sort of discussion we should be having, especially in the context of the GBR strategic environmental assessment and all the discussion we're having now about cumulative impacts. one more example of how people's perception of sustainability and acceptability changes. The Cumberland Plain west of Sydney. So what you see here is the downtown Sydney, the Blue Mountains, and the Cumberland Plain was the rolling shale country that was taken out very early. 95% of the woodland is gone. Some years ago, when we were in New South Wales, there was a patch, a big patch, that I think had been sold by the Defence Forces. Conservationists saw it as a vital relic, which it was, biologically. The developers saw it as a vital place to stick a suburb. And so you had this collision. And I'm telling the story because someone in government who was going to give the development rights to a big patch, big chunk of this patch, not all of it, that was the compromise, was telling the conservationists that they had to be reasonable and there was a need for balance. All right, so this is in the context of 95% of that stuff being taken out. And then in the context of that remaining patch, we have to be reasonable and think about balance. And that's why this whole sustainability thing can get right out of hand unless we rein it back and say, what do we actually mean by this? All right, I'll skim over this one, even though it's the biggest and most complex. The Coral Triangle. Most of you here will know where it is. 6 countries: Solomons, PNG, Timor-Leste, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines. Lots of people. And the challenge for us as developed country conservation planners coming into a place like this is to think about, it is the global centre of marine biodiversity, so it's really important. There's a lot of people directly dependent on marine resources, estimated 120 billion, but I don't know whether that's close. There's very little ability for those people to go somewhere else if somebody puts a big park there and says you can't fish anymore. The governance is hideously complex. Not only is all the inshore water finally subdivided between municipalities or communities or villages and owned or managed separately by those people, so you've got to do business with lots of people on any stretch of coastline, but then you've got 6 countries with all the complexities and so on that go with that. Huge variation in capacity. Competing research interests. The analogy that comes most readily to mind is research groups circling like sharks around a whale carcass. And I'm one of those. I'm one of those sharks. I'm looking for a bit of flesh as well. But there's a whole lot of other people playing in that game, and I have to be aware of them. And there's a fair bit of confusion and short-term thinking among the donors. So there's thinking among donors that they can fund a conservation plan, 3-year developed conservation plan, put the report in, sign it off all over, and that plan somehow, without any adaptation or learning or trimming and refinement to local conditions, will somehow go forward without any further funding. And there are other examples, and that doesn't happen. So quite often you've funded a 3-year research project, a planning project, you've got a plan, there's no resources to follow through, so it quickly becomes not very useful. We're pretty heavily engaged in the Coral Triangle. A lot of those yellow dots on the map you saw earlier are in the Coral Triangle. I'm putting a lot of time into talking to people in Indonesia and a lot of other places, and it's slow and it's essential in terms of gradually getting to know people, understand their expectations, understand the protocols, and gradually getting into a position where they want you to tell them about conservation planning and they want to think about the implications. That's the broad agenda. Okay, so how do we do all this better than just ad hoc, which is what I've been doing for a long time. there's some big ticket items, I think. So one, in terms of how we position ourselves, clearly there's maybe too much discussion, but there has been a lot of discussion about how we balance science and advocacy. And I guess my feeling has been, as long as you've got a basis for saying something that has policy relevance, then you should get out there and say it. If it's an opinion, then say it's an opinion. That kind of clears up that distinction. I don't go and paint ships, but I think painting ships is a good thing to do. It's just that it's not what I do. I think in the kind of in a democracy where the odds are so stacked in favour of the people who dig it up and ship it out, then painting a few ships is not a bad thing to do, to express some the fact there might be a problem. But as a scientist, that's not what I do. I wonder, and I don't know the answer, whether there are lessons when we start to talk about this from other fields. I think the difference is that when you talk about medicine's not straightforward, I know. There are all sorts of bureaucratic problems that mean you're not always using the best medical science. But the difference, I think, in these fields is it's very clear cut. For plane crashes, lots of people die, and that's a really bad thing. If you clear a bit more rainforest, it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's ambiguous, depending on what your values are and what your experience is. If a bridge comes down, that's a bad thing. No one would argue with that. But I think with conservation, it's harder because conservation's more remote from the average voter, and it's amorphous, and there's a lot of mixed signals about what makes good conservation. And there's still argument among the conservation science community. That's a healthy thing scientifically, but it's confusing for a lot of other people. The other thing that, coming from government and then looking around, is that we have to remember that universities are now the stronghold of free speech when it comes to these kinds of issues. CSIRO can't talk about this stuff public. AIMS, I think, the same. State government, certainly not. Commonwealth, absolutely, certainly not. So there are people in universities now who have the knowledge, have the skills, and are the only people who can go on the record to the media and other people and call it like it is. And we see good examples of that at this university. All right, so here's a list of things we can do, and this is by no means a strategy. This is just thinking through what are the dot points that we can tick off on. What are the things that we have at our disposal, the kinds of tools that we might blend into a strategy? So this is not a replacement for a strategy, it's just the pieces that might go into it. The web. There's a whole lot of web-based things that we can do. And a lot of people are doing that. And the Centre of Excellence website has, I don't know how many gazillion hits a year, but it's a lot. Terry counts them. And he has all the stats, and it's a lot. And there's a lot of stuff on that website that is about engagement as well, and informing. Media statements, that's something else we do, and we should. Science statements, likewise. I think there's a case for informing the NGOs, because they can be quite good at making a case to politicians. WWF, it's its business. WWF Australia is unashamedly an advocacy organisation. They know people in Canberra, they know how it works, they know who to talk to and when. And so it can be very useful to get the best possible science into those organisations. And I think that a lot of us are in a position where we can do some analysis of policy. And you would do that effectively if you put a somewhat more positive spin on it than I've been giving you here. So my summary of the Queensland Reserve System, while true, is not the summary that I would give to the Minister in Brisbane, because it's kind of like me saying, boy, have you stuffed up. And that's possibly not the most constructive way forward. But I can also offer them opportunities to make it better and suggest ways in which they can do that. The other thing that I'm excited about and spending a bit of time on at the moment is thinking about better measures of protected areas. So that diagram you saw about residual protected areas, they're in the wrong spots. We're not protecting the stuff that needs protection, but all our metrics hide that, because mostly we measure progress in terms of hectares. What if we, or percentages of regions or jurisdictions, what if we turned that around and said saving stuff is about changing the default? It's about avoiding loss that would have happened by default. And so the measure of our progress is in the difference between the actual outcome and the default outcome, as you saw in that diagram earlier. We can measure that. We've got a little campaign going where we're starting to develop that kind of thinking to say, you could use this measure and it would tell you more about how effective you are than hectares. Social network analysis, I don't know much about this. I know a little bit about it. I know that it's got a lot of promise. There are other people in Program 6 who know more about it than I do. That's a social network analysis from somewhere, I think, on the west coast of the USA, but it's just looking at how organisations are connected. The beauty of this is not just a cool diagram, but that you can identify individuals or organisations who are influential or who are blocking things from happening, and it does a lot more. So it gives you an idea of the human and political landscape and a much better idea of how to engage with that, and maybe even modify it so that it works better for conservation outcomes. Governance analysis, again, not something I'm expert in, but my colleague Alan Dale from Cairns is, and he's writing up some governance analysis for coastal Queensland right now. And what that adds to a network analysis is that you're looking at the way governance is supposed to work, and then matching that against the way it's actually working. So where is it going wrong? Where are the gaps? Where are the conflicts between agencies? Where are they tripping over each other? And trying to come up with a better idea about how it could be made more effective. Knowledge brokering is something we know something about, and the NERP hubs, the National Environmental Research Program hubs, and lots of other groups have one or more knowledge brokers, and their job is to actually take the science and get it out to the right people. And that can work, obviously. Something we haven't explored very much is the idea of games and simulations, which I think has got fantastic promise. So imagine if you had a really interesting and enjoyable simulation game that wasn't SimCity, it was Sim something else. And the idea was to get the best possible. You had this many dollars. You had things that you could have levels of complexity with different, political considerations coming in at the less basic levels. And the idea was to maximise some outcome for biodiversity. Not to establish lots of protected areas where they were easiest to establish, but to maximise an outcome. And I think that has huge potential. We had a very primitive example back in the 1990s when we had that interactive system for the regional forest agreement process. That it's way back now. That's Stone Age stuff compared to what people are developing now, including people at JCU, which is pretty exciting. So I think there's a teaching angle there. There's a real decision support angle, and I think that it's very likely you could give a bunch of teenagers a really complex conservation problem and say, I'll buy you all the pizzas you want, but in 2 weeks' time, I want you can compete if you like. I want to see what your answers are, and then I want to know how you did it. And I wouldn't be surprised if they came up with some pretty clever solutions to quite tricky problems. Last slide. Social marketing, lots of people do it. Coal mining companies do it. Cigarette companies do it. Conservationists tend not to. They do it a bit. But you'd have to ask what the potential is. You'd also have to ask where the resources would come from, because the big end of town has a lot of resources. And you'd have to ask what the role of science was in that. But it's an outlet, and I think really important, potentially really important one. I reckon we should be actively engaged in debates about issues like this. So where's the burden of proof? If a port authority wants to enlarge a port, why is the burden of proof on the environmental side of the argument to show that that's going to be a problem? It's all stacked one way. Why isn't the burden of proof on the other side to show you show unequivocally that there's no problem, or that you can contain whatever issues there are within these boundaries, and sure, you can go ahead. But the burden of proof tends to fall on the environmental side of the argument most of the time. What about balanced representation? The lobbyists from the big end of town are in the minister's office a lot. They're talking to senior bureaucrats, ministers, and they're getting one side of the story. They should be getting the other side of the story, and that's very patchy and disorganised. How about engaging with the big end of town directly? There are lots of ways of doing this. Some of these ways make us comfortable, more or less. Some of them make us less comfortable. Maybe the most virtuous way to do this is to do what Flora and Fauna International are doing now, which is actively engaging with BHP Billiton and other big companies to say, we'll work with you to reduce your footprint. And that'll be good for you. It may even save you some money, but if it doesn't, it will save you a lot of other grief. And that's an easy thing to contemplate if you have the resources. Offset funds. I'm the beneficiary, along with a few other people, of some offset funds from the Gorgon Barrow Island development. Arguably, the processing plant should never have gone ahead on Barrow Island, but it did, and now there's an offset scheme, and I've got some money from that, and it's explicitly blood money, and I'm using it to look at prioritisation and management actions on Western Australian islands. And you, with all of these things, you have to think about where you sit, how you feel about that. And I long ago spoke to a guy who's a campaigner from WWF about this, and he's summed it up very briefly and said, we fought it tooth and nail, we lost, and now we're going to use the money to do something good. So that seems to me a reasonable way of rationalising it. But we each deal with these issues individually. It gets a little harder then if industries are going to go in and do something and you're an advisor on a particular development. And I think there's a lot of potential for good outcomes, better outcomes, if the right people are doing that. But they obviously have to think about the potential for criticism, how that reflects on the other work they're doing. And then maybe the most difficult of all would be to actively engage in an EIS process. Because if the EIS process gave a coal seam gas company the thumbs up to develop, you're then implicated. And you might have done very clean science, but you are nonetheless implicated. So we have to think about how we feel about all of this. That's it, really. And as I said, that was just a list of points that somehow I would like to start weaving into a strategy for my group, and a strategy for a different group will be a different strategy. And I wanted to start this conversation both today and subsequently so that we can push these ideas forward. So thank you. That's it. And I think, Sally, you were saying it'd be good.
I think if we go over to UQ, if anyone's got any questions, because we're going to leave. Does anyone have any questions at UQ?
Does anyone have any questions? No, not immediately, John?
Okay.
All right. Any questions here? Comments? Sure, there's one question. Thank you.
I don't know how other people feel about that. All the issues around the offset fund, it's so contentious, and I don't know, just a thought that popped into my head. I mean, do you think that is there a danger of losing some credibility if you on your own personal scientific basis oppose some kind of development and say, look, for all these reasons, this is going to be really bad for biodiversity, and then turn around and say, but thanks for the money, that's awesome, I'll have it. Is that a danger?
I think it is, and in this case, it was easy in the Western Australian case because I wasn't involved in the debate on Barra. And that doesn't change the point that I think it shouldn't have happened. But yeah, there is a danger in all that. Engagement with industry there are pros and cons. And I don't know that there's a right answer. I couldn't say, this is where I would come down on these sorts of decisions, and I would recommend that other people did the same. Because John Brady is working with Extrata. And he said the other night, you're at the same forum on coastal development, that he had to weigh that up. He had to think about the potential for criticism and people undermining credibility against the potential to get a better outcome based on what Extrata was doing. And I think it has to be an individual decision.
And you said earlier in the presentation, and a point that I agree strongly with, is that universities are the last stronghold of free speech, and the value of being in a university is we can call a spade when government and CSIRO and a lot of other people don't have that luxury. So I think it's also a responsibility for university academics to use that. And getting industry funding, is that going to compromise that ability to say what you think, or do you think it doesn't actually?
Well, I suppose that there's actual constraint and then there's perception. So there's two sets of issues to manage. And the first one's easier, I think. You can make sure when you go into an agreement for funding that it won't in any way compromise your ability to make statements to the public, to the press. It won't compromise what you write in journal papers. So that's easier, I think. Now, I don't have a lot of experience with dealing with big companies, but the perception one's harder because your colleagues might say, well, that was a bit dodgy. And people who wanted to undermine you would then have a way of undermining you. I'm not saying it would be your colleagues, but it might be someone on the other side of the argument who said, this guy's now opposing this port development, but the bugger's been taking money from another port development, and what's his problem? That could be twisted any way you like. So perception's harder. Go ahead.
I think, I'm not sure if you covered this somehow in one of the points that you made, but one of the things that, from my experience when I work in the government for the wildlife trade issues, was that we noted that we don't participate in fora that are where the big shots are participating. So we go to our conferences in conservation and ecology, and these big conferences where the big decisions that will eventually affect you, we really don't go on. I think, and they do participate in our conferences, right? Yeah. So these big shots are in there, and they make a difference in these conservation conferences and have a word in it, and they're actually good lobbyists and well prepared. Yeah. And I think we need to start participating in these other type of fora and conferences, and then do what they do, and inform also their decisions. Sometimes they don't even know what's happening. And many times they don't want to know, but it's good for us to be able to.
No, I think that's a really good point. Any other questions? All right. Thank you. See you later.